as we go to the next topic, in the operating model, this is probably where it's really passionate. The reason that I decided to start Beyond is I recognized the operating model that I was focused on was not what was going to make the impact, right? And so Beyond is really built on how do we rethink and how do we help leaders rethink how they operate. And I always say to them, like, no one's telling us not to operate like you do now. I'm not telling anyone not to do that. What I'm saying is, how do we start to create a new tentacle that allows you to operate in a much different way? And so there's a discussion point that I think is really important, and Art talks about that. And I'm going to start a poll on that, on this one. What is the operating model? What in the current education operating model needs to change? And I promise to share it next time. And you guys talk about, and this is multiple, you can select multiple things on here. And Susan Beidler, you welcome, I see you're here. Susan, you talk about the concepts of utility U versus utopia U. Would love a little bit of that as these guys are going through the operating model of higher ed.
I wish I could say it was my own brilliant idea. Far from it. Those that know me know that I would never be quite that clever. But I just thought it was such a meaningful distinction, and this was part of an article. Yeah, as I say, 5-6 years ago. And I don't even remember the author's name. I'm embarrassed to admit, but I just thought it made such a great contrast to what we were all struggling with, which is, are we educating people to be good employees, or do we have a more, more grand ambition, which is to educate the citizenry? One could argue we're not doing so great on that in the United States these days, but that's another topic. But yeah, that's really, I just find that to be a very interesting division of thought of what is our real purpose.
But it goes back to, so I have this thing called left, and I was saying this to Keil before in the mingle, and I believe that there's these 4 shifts that higher ed has to think about, right? You have to shift to a lifelong learning model, which Brandon came and just said. You have to think about that way, because I focus on future of work. The jobs of the future that my daughter will take on when she comes out of college in 4 years doesn't exist today. So how does a university prepare her? But not only that, how do I continue to learn? I'm 50. I know I look younger than that, but I'm 50 and I am always learning. Like, how do we take on that learning element of it? So lifelong learning is one. Then the moving it from the earn it to the learn it model, right? How is competency-based education allowing for us to operate differently in that space? And then fit for purpose. So this is your discussion, Susan, that you're just having right now. How are universities fit for the purpose, for the people that they serve? So the 4,000 schools, maybe they don't need to serve the same 4,000 that everyone else is doing. How do they start to redefine and reimagine themselves to serve the right people in the market? That's when you're really going to start to see a change. And then, of course, the last piece is timeframes, which we just talked about. But I believe that those 4s, I'm going to end and I think, Gabrielle, you had the question on the chat about institution-centric. What does that mean? When I talk about that is, higher ed is built on what the rules of that institution is. What does the academic office need? What does the registrar's office need? So if you think about how it operates, everything is about, how do I get my funding? How do I get my accreditation? Everything is very institutional centric in the way that they operate. So that was it, Gabrielle. If you want, if I hope that was clear enough.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Matt, that was one of the points I was thinking of. Is so many of the larger institutions, right, are really reliant on or beholden to the accreditation agencies that are out there and are driven by these principles that you were looking at of 120 credits and many of those metrics. And if you're not accredited, what does that mean in the global scope of things? You know, and where does that kind of rank you? Because I think schools say, I would love to change, but then I always bump up against, you know, regional accreditation guidelines or my program accreditation, whether it's AACSB or things like that, that dictate these standards, which are probably more in the antiquated world.
Well, you won't get any aid. That'll be the one thing.
Yeah.
But I'm a big believer that accreditation has to get reinvented, right? And you know what? And that's okay for me to say it, because if we don't say it, Google's going to say it. Microsoft's going to start saying it. You know, if we build a fit for purpose program, if community colleges, and you guys know, I've been really focused on the community college side of the world, is I'm having discussions with the presidents that I work, and I have 19 of them that I have a discussion with every month. I want them to recognize that if they go to Google and get a certification, if they go to Tesla and get a certification, they go to Beyond Academics and get, hey, this is what I need from you, I'll hire from you. One of the institutions, we're going to do a consulting internship for community college people, right? There's no reason that I need a 4-year degree consultant. I need people that have the right aptitude, the right skill set. I'm willing to take them on with 1 year of experience, 2 years of experience. I mean, as Brandon said, there, you don't need a degree. And me and Brandon worked at Deloitte, and that's, you know, we get, I was recruiting out of Ivies there, but it doesn't mean that the Ivies are the only ones that could produce what I needed. And I'll tell you, some of the folks that are in my practice, and that's in Brandon's practice, they didn't have Ivies, but they had exposure, they had experience.
I think that's a good point, Matt, though. And you know, you and you know the companies that you mentioned are pretty cutting edge. But as long as the vast majority of industry keeps asking for a BA as an entry qualification, it's going to be very, very hard to move away from that.
And John, you're exactly right, because the more hidebound industries like law, medicine, academia, I think for the foreseeable future, they're going to continue to demand not just BAs, but doctorates, masters, and then where someone went to school will also be a factor. I think that I think they're not going to embrace the type of system that Matt advocates for, which I agree with, at least not for the time being. I think there's still that sort of snobbery towards the other forms of credentialing or the lower end non-prestige colleges.
So
I'm not sure whether it's snobbery so much as also it's a fast way to do things versus the right way to do things.
Yeah, go ahead.
Matt, there's another pragmatic factor in addition to the accrediting agencies, and that's the state legislatures. Because I'm working with a community college right now, going through an evaluation process of their ERP and SIS platforms, and they're looking to do some things that were fairly innovative and programs offering, you know, targeting first generation students and underrepresented minorities. And they were constrained because they wouldn't get, because of the structure they were looking at that was really targeted at these populations, they were not going to get funded for it. And the economics of trying to charge the students for it didn't make sense. So in terms of how public institutions, especially community colleges, get reimbursed, that's another factor that needs to get addressed in addition to the accreditation.
Yeah, and we had that discussion in the Biden one from the Zoom in last week. We had it about where does funding and how does that get through, and that probably is a whole session. I think there is a discussion that needs to be had around accreditation and around the funding model that universities are constrained by. No, absolutely, Gary. Jeff, were you trying to jump in? I wasn't sure. There was somebody that was trying to jump in and I kept interrupting them.
I think it might have been me, Matt. It just, you know, John, you made the point about entry criteria, but I would counter to say that's half the issue, because over the next 20 years, the majority of learning will happen by people not entering college, but people who are already in the workforce reimagining who they are. And what role, if any, does traditional higher ed and higher ed infrastructure play in that shift in the workforce? And it could be as, you could look at it as singular as reimagining the energy sector to go green. You can look at it as, the major tech corporations redefining, a whole industry. But most of the people who need learning it's not the entry criteria, it's the re-entry or the lateral movement criteria. And is higher ed going to be part of that? And if higher ed's not, and corporations or industry is going to do that, will that then cut higher ed out of future entry criteria?
No, I agree with you on this, on the lifelong learner aspects. I think about, what my goddaughter, went through right after graduation, and if she didn't have a degree, there was, the doors were just closed.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's that, certainly that young people segment, that initial entry is what I'm thinking. When you've got lifelong learning, my degree has nothing to do with what I actually do, but it goes back to the experience that I have. And I would posit that most of the people here have degrees that aren't necessarily related to what they're actually doing on a daily basis for their job. And they're doing their job because it's based on experience, but it's getting that first door to open that, requires the degree. And as long as that first door open is based on a degree versus experience, or converting partial degrees, that's still going to be a credential heavy focus for people in the industry.
Would you think that potentially entry criteria being too high a barrier might make higher education obsolete if they can't get past that?
I think that higher education will continue to disaggregate if they cannot get past that. But one of the things that handcuffs us into this outdated model is how our students' ultimate customers view it. As long as the kids who graduate from college, are having to apply for jobs, or people who haven't graduated from college that see jobs that are their entry-level jobs in the career that says BA required, there's going to be a roadblock. Now, if you have, 80 credits or 90 credits, but you don't have a degree, that doesn't mean that you don't have knowledge and skill. And, industry and higher ed has got to figure out how to convert those credits that don't work into a degree into something that is a credential that people will accept.
Yeah, I call that credit decay. There's so much credit decay that happens, and the ones that can't afford it, all of a sudden they're hamstrung by it. Now, Keil, I'll say to you, I know you said that I don't expect everything in higher ed. I don't expect traditional higher ed to change. Meaning, if the law firms need a lawyer to come out of a law school, I'm saying, hey, do what you need to do. I believe that their higher ed has to create different tentacles to serve different people. Like, if you still need to have a traditional learning model, you need to have a traditional, experience on college. Hey, my daughter is picking a school because it's warm, and she's picking a school that has a big football team and a big basketball team, and she's looking at as an experience, right? And I get that. But I think we have to look at the future of work element that Brandon's talking about, the upskilling and the reskilling, and how do we start creating, offerings that help beyond the traditional learner, but people that need it, and how do we start creating an operating model that may become the tradition, and the non-tradition is what my daughter is going to go through, right? I think there's going to be a potential shift as we go through that way.
Yeah, but the traditional model that you talk about, especially for the high-end careers, is simply too expensive in the cost and opportunity cost.
Sure.
The people are coming out with $100,000 in debt. If we just offer alternatives to some people, like a poor man's system where some people are getting boot camps and alternative credentialing, we're retaining for the high-paying managerial and professional careers, the big stack of degree system, then the problems will continue. You're helping some people, but the problems will continue on the other end.
So I'll give this argument to you, Keil. I'm a criminal justice major. I make more than a doctor, and I make more than an engineer, and I make more than a lawyer. And I'm a criminal justice major. Why? Because it is what I did after I got my degree. It's after I got my experience. It's because I took a ABAP 4 class on SAP. It's because I took a credential course that I did that. And like, there is, I think, and I said this to my kids, a college degree and a college major doesn't default you to your successes or your careers. It is just allowing you to start to navigate it. And I believe, like with us having these type of discussions, I mean, Brandon's a partner at Deloitte, and we have people at Cengage and other places that could hire differently. I think it's a hiring model that has to change. That's what John was saying, is I think we as a collective force, this FutureX Tribe force, has to get the message out there that says, hey, maybe there's a different model of that, and I'm not against what you're saying, Keil. I want everyone to do well, and I'm for that. I believe that shouldn't be the reason people do not succeed either.
Matt, one thing you mentioned, like your law school may not change or things like that, or law professions. California, you don't have to go to law school to sit for the bar anymore, right? You can just study on your own and sit for the bar. I mean, they're changing that access, that if maybe going to law school isn't for you, incurring, going to a 4-year degree, then having to get the additional years of law school, study and just go straight in and become a certified lawyer.
And that's
credentials for the state.
And that's the way it used to be nationwide. You went, you read law with a lawyer, and you stayed with that lawyer. You apprenticed with that lawyer for a couple of years, and you took the bar. The law schools are a recent construct.
But, Lauren, we were talking about that with being able to get your license as a lawyer without going to a university to get your degree and all that. I think what Keil's saying is, if you do that, what opportunities are there for you then in a big company to hire you? They're going to look at that credential and say, it's not the same value as what you just did on the side privately. So I think it's finding that kind of, how can we accommodate those? Because those lawyers coming out without that big university degree are probably just as good. They're different, they're just as good, they just don't know the right people. So it's working to find a solution and saying that that is valuable in itself, and that those big companies look at those things with value as well. That's changing the mindset. And I think that's so critical. That's the hard thing we have today, is trying to recreate and have them look at different student types differently.
It's a typical transformative thing. Transformation like that and that scale is not easy, and it takes a long time. But I think it's this kinds of conversations that start that ball, and it's a great thing.
Matt, maybe I can tie together what Gary's saying with what Brandon is saying on my own experience. So about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I was the same as you, Brandon. I had to, I was in the military, then I got out. I was thinking to go to college, but I had to make money. So I looked around and I found a program, and this ties into what Gary is saying. This is in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. KPMG offered, together with the Amsterdam Polytechnic University, a degree program where you would work for KPMG 3 days a week. They would pay you for those 3 days a week, and the other 2 days you would go to college, and you would finish your degree in about 2 years. Now, what's the point? I can guarantee you KPMG never offered that program here in the US, but because the funding model of the government over there is maybe a bit more flexible, they were allowed to do that. And I wonder how many opportunities that we actually missed because of what Gary is saying, that yes, there's a logical operating model of an institution, but how much can they do without being unchained from the burdens of funding, especially. But I always thought that was very interesting that KPMG, a global company, would offer these very innovative programs, but not everywhere. So there has to be a reason for that. And I think it's exactly what Brandon was saying.
All right. Hey, really quick. This is how we do this. We'll end the recording in a couple minutes, in a second, so that my team knows where to break it. And then we stop the recording, because there's a lot of people who like to just talk off record, and then we last week we had about 30 minutes of just great dialogue because people were willing to have a better conversation without it recording. But I want to, first of all, I mean, these Zoom-ins, I hope you guys are enjoying it. I think that what Jason has said is right. We need to have the right discussions. We need to rethink the discussions. We're all pretty influential in this space, right? At Beyond, that was one of my premises is I want to publish, thought, leadership, and ideas, not by what Matt Alex says, but what others are saying, and allow for that to start to really disseminate in market so that we all think of it differently. We have to work collectively on an operating model that works. We have to work collectively in the discussions that we are helping presidents, chancellors, deans, CIOs, whatever we work with, we have to help them through that process. So I believe that we are going to have a great opportunity that's going to take us to the next 2021 and beyond.